He has previously published in War on the Rocks, Texas National Security Review, Philosophical Studies, and the Journal of Military Ethics, and numerous other journals. We're just going to give a couple of seconds so everyone who has to can exit the room. Everyone is, of course, welcome to stay, everyone who's assigned here. And our panels will be with us, our panelists, in just a moment. Here we go, we can start our session now. As I mentioned, Nathan Wood will be our moderator, and he will introduce the other panelists that are here with us. Thank you very much. We can welcome them with a round of applause, a very well-deserved round of applause. Thank you, thank you. All yours.
All right. All right, first of all, thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to the organizers for allowing us to speak today. So we recognize that everyone's been sitting for a little bit of time now, and people might be getting a little bit tired. So we're going to try to keep our panel a little bit more conversational and open so that we can keep the energy up in here before everyone falls asleep. Yeah. So as she said, I'm Nathan Wood. I am a junior research grouper at the Technical University of Hamburg, where I'm leading an interdisciplinary group where we're looking at ethical and legal and operational aspects of AI-enabled autonomous systems in the military. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Nick Wobma is the Deputy Branch Head of Law, and he is at the CCD COE in Tallinn. Yeah. Where he does military education and ethics and law of war. Yeah. Jonathan Kwik is a researcher at the Astor Institute, where he also works on legal aspects of autonomous and AI-enabled systems in the military. And at the end, we have Dr. Aleksi Kajander, who is also at NATO CCD COE and is at the Tallinn Technical University, right?
University of Technology, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the impetus for this panel and what sort of motivated me to do it is that there is a lot of discussion going on, and we've heard a lot of it today, about the many ways that AI may be able to improve the ethical and the legal and the operational aspects of military planning and execution. And we also have a lot of discussions that are ongoing about the ethical and legal challenges of military AI. Now, one thing that I see that is often missing, although I will say that today I've been pleasantly surprised to see a shifting nature of the discussions here, is that there seems to be a lot of oversight of the military challenges of certain AI systems and certain types of AI capabilities. And so the point of this panel is not to show that certain systems shouldn't ever be used or that they're inherently problematic, but instead to give kind of a scattershot approach and to just paint a broad picture of what kinds of systems raise different types of challenges from a military perspective. So what kinds of AI capability, what kinds of AI training regimen create different types of operational challenges, and how those operational challenges might undermine the very justification that we're being given for why we might want to uptake AI in the military. And so, as I said, the point of this is not to say we shouldn't use AI per se, but just to balance the playing field, as it were, to give practitioners, policymakers, military professionals the right framework for understanding all of the risks and benefits of AI. Yeah. So the way that we're going to go about this is I'm going to say a few words about the technological side of things, where I see challenges from a technical standpoint, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lieutenant Colonel Wobma, who's going to talk about some of the IHL challenges, some of the legal issues, and how those impact on military readiness, on military capability. And then Dr. Kwik is going to speak to some more specific challenges in how we actually utilize AI systems, the kinds of operational risks that might come up with that, and how we can think about how adversaries might use AI and how we can try to counter that AI, and how doing this cat and mouse game can inform us of a broader set of risks and challenges. And then we're finally going to move to Dr. Kajander, who's going to talk about some of the sort of supply side issues that creep into AI systems and how we need to think about the whole of the life cycle of an AI system to understand all of the operational risks that might come into play. Yeah. So for myself, there are a couple of things that I think are really important when we're thinking about military AI. The first thing that is really important is that we are specific about the kinds of systems we're talking about. We've had a lot of discussions here today where people talk about AI, or they talk about military AI, but the challenges of a natural language processing system are not the same as the challenges of an object identification system, and those are different from the challenges of big data analytics. All of these things are built in different ways, they utilize different types of AI, and they raise different distinct operational challenges. And so it's really important that we think more in terms of distinct systems with distinct operational contexts and the kinds of challenges that arise with that. Yeah. And another thing that I think is important that we think about from the technical side is we think about exactly how AI systems are built and what technically is challenging then about that. So in particular, one thing that I have been concerned about in the last year or two as I see more and more of this emphasis on using machine learning trained systems in the military. In particular, we see a push to use LLMs or use agentic AI systems. There seems to be a rather broad lack of appreciation of all that goes into these systems in the basic development of them and the kinds of operational challenges that arise out of that. So 3 examples that I would like to bring into the discussion at the outset is, first of all, the fact that there's lots of companies, there's lots of development labs that will talk about how they have machine learning trained systems that are maybe safe to use or that don't present any challenges because they're only trained on the data set that the military gives them, for example. And that might be true for the last leg of the training process when you're doing the reinforcement learning with human feedback, where you're really fine-tuning the system. But the basic nuts and bolts of the system are almost always going to involve a massive data set that is usually not possible to even potentially examine all of the bits of data in there to see whether any of that data is poisoned, what that might do to the system during operations. This is a point that Aleksi is going to talk about further when I give the mic over to him. But just in general, we need to have in mind that no matter how much attention we pay to the exact fine-tuning of a system, at the last leg, there's still a massive backlog of data that we're not looking into, in many cases because we can't look into it, because it's simply too much. And when you're thinking about large language models, they're trained on, to a large extent, the internet. And so there could be anything in that training set, and in a sense there is everything in that training set, which is important for training the model to be robust about its ability to provide natural language outputs, but it also means that there are risks inherent in that, to the security of the data, to the veracity of the data. And so that's an important thing that we need to have in mind. And that brings me to the second point that I think is really important for practitioners and policymakers to have in mind, which is that you need very few instances of poisoned data for a model to be contaminated, and to be contaminated to a very significant degree. So recent research from this last year shows that for whatever model size, that as few as 250 instances of poisoned data can catastrophically undermine a model. Now, 250 instances is not that many instances. And that's something that everyone needs to have in mind, which isn't to say that we shouldn't use these systems, but we need to know these risks are in there, and we need to use these systems with intent in the knowledge of these risks. And the final thing I would like to bring forward before I hand the mic to Lieutenant Colonel Wobma is agentic AI. So there's been a couple of presentations already today on agentic AI, and I was very pleased to see that there was a lot of attention paid to the inherent operational security risks of these systems, the inherent military risks of these systems. But I think it's very important that we hit that hard, that agentic AI does provide a lot of possibilities. It does create opportunities for us to automate whole aspects of military planning and execution, which is something that has allure, and it's something that may also have value. But we need to always have in mind that an agentic system, the heart and soul of it, what makes it worth procuring in the first place, is that it can do things. It can reach into your databases, it can reach into your platforms, and it can do things. And because these systems are almost exclusively built on some large machine learning model, it has some massive data set inherent in it, we need to interrogate that data set. If the system can reach into our defense infrastructures and access data, if it can reach into our defense infrastructures and move things around, we need to know that the foundations of this are clean, that they are secure. And if the foundations of this are machine learning models that are massive, that are built on massive data sets, then that raises fairly significant operational security risks. And that's something I think we really need to have in mind, especially in light of the fact that there are numerous attack vectors that people can use for agentic AI systems, and virtually none of them have been adequately patched. Yeah. So these are some of the general technical worries that I have in mind that, that make me motivated to write articles and to give talks. But the important thing to have in mind as well is that these technical worries, they feed into a number of other aspects of how military operations are planned and executed, all of which have an impact on our readiness, and which is the heart and soul of this panel today, is military readiness and how AI could undermine that. Now, and with that in mind, I'm going to hand over the mic to Lieutenant Colonel Wobma to talk a little bit about IHL and military education.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you for bringing us together. I will approach this from a military and a legal perspective, focusing on how artificial intelligence and cyber operations change the information environment in which international humanitarian law operates. Armed conflict today unfolds across cognitive, virtual, and physical domains. International humanitarian law is built on the assumption of friction within that environment. It presumes time to observe, to understand, to decide, and to act. Legal judgment relies on human cognition operating under uncertainty, but with some capacity to verify the facts, to anticipate effects, and to trace responsibility. AI-enabled cyber operations fundamentally alter those conditions. They compress decision cycles, obscure causal chains, and distribute decision-making across interconnected systems. Discrete acts increasingly become continuous processes. But this does not mean that international humanitarian law does not apply or ceases to apply. It does mean that the conditions under which the law is applied is being placed under a significant type of stress. From a legal perspective, this matters because international humanitarian law depends on reasonable assessments made in good faith based on information available at the time. AI does not remove uncertainty, but it does reshape it. Legal risks shift away from individual decisions and towards system design, configuration, data dependencies, and ongoing oversight. So from a military standpoint, this creates a specific operational reality. Commanders remain responsible, but their ability to know, to verify, and to anticipate effects is increasingly mediated by AI-enabled systems. This directly affects how feasibility, precaution, and proportionality can be assessed in practice. So the issue is not a loss of responsibility, but a constraint in the epistemic access, so how you find out the information that you need in order to come to the decision. So this is military relevant because international humanitarian law is not only an enabling legal framework, but also an operational premise. It reflects the understanding that short-term tactical advantage achieved by disregarding legally defined principles, it may accelerate decision cycles or create momentary dominance, but often it does so at the cost of the strategic legitimacy of the operation. Violations or even the perception that AI-enabled operations operate beyond meaningful human control can erode the popular support of your operation. It can undermine the coalition cohesion and weaken political authority at home and abroad. So in that sense, non-compliance may compress the ODA loop in the short term, so your ability to act and act faster than your opponent, but it does risk losing the broader contest over credibility, restraint and normative authority that ultimately shapes the outcome of modern conflicts. So international humanitarian law therefore functions not only as a framework for lawful conduct, but as a stabilizing force that links military effectiveness to long-term strategic sustainability. So currently I'm an editor of an upcoming OUP, Oxford University Press, and CCDCUE volume on artificial intelligence in armed conflict, which focuses on the AI and cyber interplay and is viewed through the lens of international law. It's written by established and emerging expert authors, of which two are sitting next to me. And they address different aspects of this problem space. And my role has been to work through their recommendations and then synthesize them across the domains. So looking across the different domains, including in the chapters, we have a chapter on cyber offense in AI, cyber defense in AI, surveillance, detention, and humanitarian operations. But out of all these different topics where we use AI in armed conflict, there is a common structural pattern that emerges. The legal challenge is not confined to a single use case, but it is systemic. Legal risk is no longer concentrated at the moment of action, as it was and often still is in the kinetic domain, but now it's distributed across the whole life cycle of systems, or Aleksi also writes a chapter about. So this reframes the human role rather than that it removes it. Humans are not displaced from decision making, but their role shifts from last-minute intervention to an architecture, supervision, and risk management type of role. So compliance with international humanitarian law becomes continuous rather than momentary. Duties such as precaution and constant care and due diligence, they must be embedded now also upstream, so into how the systems are built, how they are tested, and how they're constrained, and how they are governed. None of this requires an immediate rewrite of the law, or a legal reset, or a technological exceptionalism. International law has adapted to many different technologies before, but what it does require is clarity about where the responsibility attaches, a realistic appreciation of speed, the opacity and interdependence, and a commitment to preserving meaningful human judgment through system design. So, if there's one point that I would emphasize for this discussion, it is this. AI and cyber operations force us to see legality as a process over time, rather than a single decision point. Preserving human judgment within the information environment is not just an ethical concern, but it is a legal necessity if international humanitarian law is to remain credible and operational. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Dr. Kwik?
Right, fantastic. Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Nate, for the invitation to this panel. I initially became interested in joining this panel because of the pitch you gave to me, which was, hey, Jonathan, if you noticed that a lot of the discussions, they focus a lot on the good things about AI and the attractive things, which are easy to discuss. But then sometimes you forget the bad things and the risks, which one of these that you've mentioned is this vulnerability to outside influence. And I think this is particularly present in a lot of the discussions where even if you're talking about risk, it's usually about you not doing your work well. So you've not collected the proper data, you aren't using it well. But I think like one key player in this play that we're missing is obviously the opponent. And that's what I always say, if you're talking about armed conflict, it is a dialectic process. Now, that's a very fancy word that I often use. It basically means conversation. So in a war, you don't have the right to a monologue because your opponent is going to try to talk back. And this interplay, and that's what you already mentioned, this cat and mouse game, is particularly important with AI because obviously war has always been a dialogue. It has always been a cat and mouse game. But AI does change a few things, which I want to emphasize. So first, and it's already been touched upon a bit, is the amount of attack vectors and attack surface, which basically means a type of tactics that you can deploy to disrupt your opponent's AI system is massively inflated. You can do input attacks. So you can think, for example, well, we've talked about cyber. You can use a cyber attack to do a prompt injection into an LLM that you're using, and then suddenly it behaves completely strangely, or it will create an output that is beneficial to your enemy without you even noticing. A different thing, and that's what Aleksi is going to talk about, is data poisoning, where you basically poison the well. The data that is going to be used to train your AI model has been compromised. So then you end up with a compromised AI model. Again, it's often invisible because 350 instances of the 250 instances of the millions or billions of data points that you put inside. It's very difficult to determine. Yeah. There's also another thing that I rarely see people talk about. I call it a social engineering attack, where you don't even necessarily need to attack the AI system, but you attack the way that the users are employing this AI system. So there's good practices and there's bad practices. There's good ways to prompt and there's bad ways to prompt. If you can manipulate your enemy to making bad prompts, that's also an effective way to attack the AI. So there's many more attack vectors and attack surfaces. Many of these tactics are invisible. And even if you're purely talking in an ops situation, so in the field, the thing is already flying around, then you still have what's called like evasion or input attacks. The most famous one is that you can show a QR code, and then suddenly the camera of a drone doesn't recognize you anymore. For us, it's ridiculous. But for an AI, it gets fooled by these ridiculous things very easily. So now, in the end, I am still a lawyer, Nate, so I still want to slip in some legal comments. So what does this mean from a legal perspective? Well, my first instinct would be, well, it actually doesn't change that much in the sense that it doesn't change your basic obligation to field systems that are reliable. Like if you are deploying a system that is just so vulnerable to being disrupted by the enemy that it just becomes indiscriminate super easily, I think that's on you. And this goes back into your earlier point of this is an important thing to discuss, because if you're developing systems, think about what your enemy can do to it. And this is also on you to secure a minimum level of safety. But on the other hand, and I've done some research on this, it's also a bit difficult for me from a legal perspective to say that it is purely on the user. So for example, you have a few of these adversarial attacks, like there's a backdoor, for example. This is a very targeted input that, for example, it sees the number, it sees a red number 7 and then it malfunctions. But in all other situations, it's fine. And it's hidden. Well, in this situation, I've argued in the past that the opponent, so the party that has manipulated the system, has so much control over when the malfunction will appear. And the owner probably, if they've done their work right, all of the due diligence, if they've done all that they can and they still haven't recognized it, it might not be entirely fair to then put everything on the user. So again, in this spirit of having war as a conversation, I think it's also important to look at the role of the opponent, but also their own legal risk and legal obligations. So bottom line from me is there are some conditions where it's probably not reasonable to put everything on the user if they've done all they can. But I would still argue that if you're using these kinds of systems, you know they're so vulnerable that you do have a level of heightened responsibility as the owner to make sure that, to your maximum possible extent, that these are safe. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And so one of the points that you've already brought up a number of times when you were speaking, and I also brought it up, was the security of the supply chain, the cleanliness of the supply chain, which is obviously a very critical element of any use of emerging AI technologies, especially anything that uses machine learning. And that's something that I know you've been working on, Aleksi, so could you tell us a little bit more about that side of it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you for the invite. So as Nick mentioned, I am authoring the chapter in that aforementioned publication on the digital supply chain security. And I had a bit of a personal rude reminder about the importance of the supply chain, because I'm a bit more casually dressed than I would have liked to, because my suit is still in Madrid. So even in your personal life, of course, there's dependencies on supply chain, but think about it for the artificial intelligence. So as has been mentioned, we have training data, so which fundamentally, in a way, shapes how the AI sees the world, if you will. And now, as has been mentioned, it doesn't take that many incidents to actually poison that sort of worldview. And if you're scooping up the internet as of present, you already know that you're going to get Russian propaganda, for example, which is infesting the internet. And you will get all sorts of other types of influence operations and other types of content you probably don't want into your artificial intelligence. But as Nathan points out, there is not necessarily that much that you can do about it, depending on where do you get your AI systems. And it is very important to know that. What was the initial training data? How was it secured? What are the risks involved with it? But when it comes to artificial intelligence, it also requires a bit of a mindset change when it comes to its procurement, because it is not something that once you have it, it's done. It's not like buying a rifle, which will mechanically degrade over time, of course, but the rifle doesn't learn. It will always perform the same. With artificial intelligence, you will update it, and every time you update it, if you introduce more training data, you're introducing more opportunities for that training data to be poisoned. Moreover, you can have systems that rely on, for example, cloud infrastructure. That adds another layer of challenge. What if there's a cyber operation against that cloud infrastructure, and through that you will have a compromise of your artificial intelligence? Similarly, from a legal perspective, how secure is your data on that cloud? That is another question. What are the sort of local legislations that may enable authorities or foreign governments to gain access to the data on that cloud network that you're using? All those sorts of complications come into play. And fundamentally, the mindset change is that with artificial intelligence, the supply chain security is very much a constant process. You need constant vigilance to make sure your artificial intelligence stays safe. And when it comes to the legislative, especially in terms of international law and international humanitarian law aspects of this, as Jonathan quite rightly points out, there are certain base levels of security that you need to have, but you also have to understand that in 1949, when the Geneva Conventions were being drafted, AI supply chain security was not at the top of the list of topics to be discussed. And in that sense, we are lacking specific legal instruments that comment on this particular matter. Now, I authored a paper on the cybersecurity of weapon systems, which, to save you a bit of amazing reading, basically concluded that international humanitarian law requires you to have a base level of cybersecurity so that at least your weapons do not become indiscriminate. But beyond that, it actually offers very little. And therefore, it's important to recognize that there's not really a driving force from international law to secure the supply chain of your artificial intelligence systems. Rather, it's the natural incentive that a military would have to make sure that your systems are secure. And as has been mentioned, if all it takes is for the enemy to flash a red number 7 and now your artificial intelligence system stops functioning, you probably do not want to figure that out when you are in an armed conflict. You want to be aware of that way before that. But to do that, international law will not, or international humanitarian law will not tell you that you have to make sure that the enemy can't get into your system. It's more concerned with protecting humanitarian principles. So where do you go? Well, if we look at the European Union's legal framework, for example, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, I think, demonstrates excellent ways to deal with supply chain security when it comes to digital products. And of course, DORA is applicable to the financial sector, so it's not applicable to the military. But if you look at what it does, it requires you to map third-party dependencies. It requires you to have certain contractual provisions with your third-party suppliers to ensure that you can monitor, you can test, and you have the right to do that, as well as to terminate any contracts if they fail their cybersecurity obligations. And therefore, while not applicable to the military, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the best practices from cybersecurity law, although not applicable to the military, and see what they could do to help keep the supply chain of artificial intelligence secure. Because as I said, it is not a question that you purchase or you adopt an artificial intelligence system and that you're done, you're safe. No, it is a process that is ongoing and it requires constant vigilance. And I think with that, let's proceed with the other part of this panel.
Yeah. Yeah, many thanks, Aleksi. So as I said at the outset, my intention with this panel is not for us to lecture you guys about what you should and shouldn't do. The point of this panel is to start an interrogative dialogue about challenges that really exist and how we might be able to address those challenges, or not. And if we can't address certain challenges, then we figure out, do we use systems for these types of capabilities or not? That we have honest discussions about the real limits of systems and what those limits mean for military capability and for military deployment. And so with that in mind, with this idea that we should have a dialogue about this, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a couple of questions. But while we're having this discussion up here, I would encourage everyone to think of your own questions, because afterwards, hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes or so to have question and answer session with you as well, because this is something that we should all be involved in, not just the 4 of us up here. So I'm going to present a couple of questions to each of the panelists myself, and then afterwards I would like to have some time for you guys to ask your questions as well. Yeah. So, Lieutenant Colonel Wobma, one of the things you pointed out that is very important for us all to bear in mind is the fact that IHL, international law, is a force multiplier for our militaries, at least. That is one of the reasons why we follow the law. Also because it's good to, also because it's right, but because it makes us better warfighters. Now, a challenge to that, though, I think that a lot of people have in mind, especially looking at ongoing events, is whether we might need to leave some aspects of international law or maybe modify them in situations of supreme emergency. So what I'd like to ask you is whether or not you think this is a correct view, or how we might nuance this view, and maybe you could compare, for example, the realities on the ground for a Ukrainian combatant versus the realities for a Dutch soldier thinking about AI right now, and how do these differing realities change what IHL means for these people?
Thank you. So, supreme emergency is, I think, mainly a concept from ethical theory, not per se from international humanitarian law, because in law there is no clause that suspends core rules, because the threat is existential. Principles such as distinction, proportionality, precautions, they continue to apply, and military necessity is already built into the structure of that law, so it operates within it and not above it. But what it does change in practice is the decision environment. Time pressure, uncertainty, and fear increase, and information becomes less reliable, which makes lawful judgment harder. But not optional. So in that sense, rules are not weakened, but the burden on good faith assessment becomes heavier. And from a military perspective, it's also important to organize the weakening adherence to norms that often produce side effects. I already said as much before, but even if it appears to generate short-term advantages, it will undermine or can undermine the legitimacy, the coalition support, etc. I said it before. So just saying modern conflict is not decided by the battlefield metrics alone, even though it's existential or not. But as for the difference between militaries, without going into the specific countries, but I guess everybody can form a picture, especially with Ukraine, but just saying the legal norms are the same for all parties. So what differs is the operational context and the feasibility. So if you're an army that has the time or more precision to do a certain operation, then you're probably expected to take more precautions than if you're an army that's under immediate stress or you have limited means. So, for example, if you have smart bombs and dumb bombs, there may be a discussion on which you could have used, depending. But if there is no smart bombs available, then it's not a discussion after all, but that doesn't make it unlawful to use the dumb bombs. So the standard is feasibility under the circumstances, and less so nationality. So point is, even under extreme threat, the law does not disappear. What changes is how demanding lawful judgment becomes.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And to you, Jonathan, I was also, one of the things that you didn't speak to, but that I know that you are working on, is ways that we can use AI against adversarial AI, or ways that we can try to undermine adversarial AI. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is whether or not you think there are any lessons that we can draw for our own uses of AI when we think about how we might counter adversarial AI. And if we're thinking through this cat and mouse game, like, well, what if we do this? What do they do? If they do this, what do we do? Is there a way for us to basically bootstrap our own AI defense into effect just by red teaming the enemy and then red teaming ourselves with regards to the red teamed enemy, and just going back and forth in our own iterative process? Do you think that there's a way for us to kind of create our own virtuous cycles that way?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's such an interesting point. I actually didn't think about this beforehand, but I think it makes a lot of sense. The idea of red teaming is you try to break your own systems. Mm-hmm. And I think this makes a lot of sense because, of course, why are these adversarial attacks so difficult to predict and so varied? It is because they do stem from human ingenuity. It comes from humans just relentlessly trying and prodding and reverse engineering and trying to find the tiniest little hole. And that's how the enemy is getting to our AI systems. So I would say if you know that humans are very good at this and they often enjoy it, even you know from the cyber domain, I would say definitely capitalize on this. So I think the idea of red teaming your own systems is brilliant. We've seen it done in the cyber domain, so it will also work in the AI space. And here I would actually add to that really try to get into your enemy's mind space in terms of think about what their likely knowledge is of your AI system. So if and that also goes back into your own security of your own data set. So if you know you've done the maximum to secure the data sets that you use, then hopefully the enemy does not have access to them. Well, then you know what they can and cannot do in terms of reverse engineering the model, for example. You can think about their action space. What is their possible routes they can take to attack your AI system? But also the intent is quite important. Think about what they intend to achieve by attacking your AI system. So do they, for example, just want to camouflage their own tanks or their own soldiers so they aren't spotted by your AI system? Or do they want to get your AI system to malfunction and friendly fire, for example? Thinking that way, you will probably be able to determine the likely paths that your opponent is likely to take against your systems and then take action to resolve this. And another thing I would like to second Aleksi's mention about constant vigilance, because I think that's extremely important. Again, in the spirit of balancing what we can reasonably expect between the user of the AI system and the opponent, I would say that in the use case of the red number 7, if it is extremely well hidden, from a legal perspective, I would find it extremely difficult to say this is your fault, like you're in violation, because probably the owner of the AI system acted reasonably. Coming back to this idea of the reasonable, what we can reasonably expect, but this is only acceptable once, I would say, because afterwards you know that your system is vulnerable to the red number 7. So then it is on the user of the AI system to do something. The problem is, you don't always know that the red number 7 did something. And that's why I often advocate for states need to have very good iterative feedback mechanisms, logging, knowing what went wrong, and then having a quick response mechanism in place. So again, going back to this idea of war is a dialogue. You say something, the opponent says something, but now it's your turn again, so you have to take that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one thing that's very important to make clear as well is that a lot of, when you're talking about our responsibilities, what the law requires, I think we intuitively start to think about the legal side, but it's important to keep in mind that this also does have operational impact as well. If the red number 7 breaks the system, that doesn't just mean the system's going to fire on civilians or violate proportionality or whatever. It might mean that an enemy tank battalion moves through a gap. And so we need to have in mind that a lot of these things that worry ethicists and lawyers should worry military personnel as well. They should worry industry partners. And we need to balance this discussion more about the military benefits and the military risks, because there are both involved.
And the friendly fire thing, there's no prohibition on shooting your own soldiers, but it is very militarily problematic.
Yeah, and then the last question that I'll ask before I open it up to the audience is for Aleksi. So one of the things that Jonathan's already brought up is sort of the seeming oddness of some types of attack vectors. Red number 7 is not the type of thing you would expect to be a trigger mechanism. A QR code on a tank is not the sort of thing that should break an AI system. And so my question to you would be whether or not, as far as you know, there are ways for us to figure out what even is in these systems that might make them go wrong. Can we find what data is poisoned, or to what extent it is poisoned? And if we can, are there ways to mitigate the risks of that? If we can't, are there other ways to mitigate the risks? I mean, just in general, whether or not we can find poisoned data, we need to have a strategy for how we deal with using these systems. And that strategy might be don't use them here, there, or otherwise. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are, on sort of the location of the problems and mitigation of the problems.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. Not to reinforce the stereotype of lawyers always answering, it depends whenever asked a good question, but it really does depend on the type of system. It also depends on the type of capabilities that you have for the testing. And also, the term AI covers very differing types of systems. You have LLMs. LLMs are known to hallucinate. OpenAI thinks that it's a mathematical inevitability, so it will always have a degree of malfunction there. Versus if you have something that's machine learning that's based on, very sort of rigid statistics and that sort of thing, then, the faults there are going to look different. And what types of poison data you will have there will look very different. And in that sense, it's also a question of what are the risks involved with the poison data, and where are the systems used, what is the supervision that you have. The key unifying part about all of this is that you have to think about it in advance. You really have to start thinking of the supply chain security now and not when you're in an armed conflict. And you have to keep maintaining that vigilance. I think red teaming is a very good idea, because there are unexpected ways that artificial intelligence reacts and perceives reality. Just to give you an example, an artificial intelligence that was trained to find water doesn't understand what water is, right? So how do you identify water if you're an AI system? Easy. You look at the electromagnetic spectrum of water. Only problem is that aluminium turns out to have a very similar spectrum. So the AI detected vast reservoirs of water in an industrial stockyard. So that's probably not ideal if you're trying to identify military equipment. You have to understand, how does the AI actually also perceive that military equipment? And therefore, you can get into this, well, how could I mess with this if I was the adversary? How can I trick this type of system? And just to maybe add a little bit of nuance to Jonathan's point, I think it's a very good idea to look at what is most beneficial from your enemy's perspective. If you have a very dramatic failure of your system, or you have clearly illegal sort of instructions or recommendations coming from your decision support systems, for example, you're going to realize something is wrong, right? But what if you simply have bad advice, right? You have bad deployments, you have bad identification, and you are already expecting the artificial intelligence to have a failure rate. It's not perfect, neither are we, of course. But, well, as I mentioned, hallucinations are inevitable with LLMs. So if you were the adversary, obviously you would try to, drive up those numbers, and ideally, you would never look for them, right? It's well disguised. And that emphasizes just how important it is to understand your systems. What are its capabilities? What is its expected performance? And how can you test it and really push it to its limits? And in that sense, it's very, very important to understand, how does your AI actually do what it does? And therefore, hopefully, you can identify its weak points. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and as I said at the outset, and again before I ask my questions, this is something that needs to be a dialogue. It's not just something where I think it would be nice for us to chat. This has to be something where technology experts and military practitioners and policymakers ask each other these questions and pose these challenges to one another. Pose the challenge to the industry partner who wants to tell you something, of where their thing breaks, why it breaks, when it breaks. And if they can't tell you that it's going to break at some point and exactly why it might break, then they're probably not telling you everything. And so it's really important that we can become used to probing. We become used to asking hard questions and trying to find the limits, and that we have this as a dialogue. And with that in mind, I would like to open up the floor to anyone who has questions from the audience so that we can start this dialogue together. Yo. Yeah, just shout.
Oh, there's a microphone.
Is there a mic? Oh, look at that. Don't shout.
Well, thank you so much for this. I don't know if this works. Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Ahmad. I'm from Exist. We are a consortium looking at AI and existential risks, specifically in nuclear weapons, biological sector, not all autonomous weapons. And just quickly, wow, fantastic discussion. Aleksi, just to your point on international humanitarian law and how limited it is. And the fact that even the EU AI Act is great until there's exceptions to the law, and that's, of course, the defense and security sector. So my question to both Jonathan and to Aleksi, if that's okay, is what do you foresee in terms of a global governance that also reflects a post-Second World War reality, where we can actually have the involvement of all the stakeholders? And how does that enforcement look like? because governance is one thing, the laws are another, and then how those laws are then applied, it's the genie is in the box at the moment. So how do we ensure that those risks that you're talking about are contained, are enforced, monitored, and there are reliable ways to enforce it through carrot and stick? Thank you.
Yeah. So while they're answering, maybe if someone else has a question, you can raise your hand so we can move the mic around then. Yeah. So, Jonathan, Aleksi, whoever wants to start. Yeah, you can answer.
Okay. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that excellent question. If we think about the enforcement, right, as I mentioned, because we don't have this international law as of yet that really requires you to think of it, at the moment, it comes to the natural incentive of the militaries to keep these systems secure, and also by extension to their private partners, right? Because private industry drives this innovation, and there, I think, that will be a very powerful force, of course. However, if we look at how our weapon systems reviewed currently in terms of Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 is not perhaps a very encouraging example in the sense that those reviews don't have to be public. Of course, we trust all the countries in good faith to do their weapon reviews, but we really don't have a way of verifying that very efficiently in the public domain. And therefore, considering also the discussion we had about adversarial attacks against artificial intelligence systems, we have quite an uneasy situation where it is very classified because we don't want the enemy to have information about our systems. How do they work? How have they been tested? Where do they perform well? And therefore, we're likely to be in a very similar situation that those types of reviews will remain classified. And therefore, in terms of the enforcement, like I said, we have Article 36. We hope that countries are doing it. But I think in terms of a practical effect, I think this will have to come down to the private industry and the military sort of cooperation to make a meaningful way of making sure that only sort of responsible systems are being developed that are cyber secure, hopefully. Jonathan?
You kind of stole my thunder there. You basically said many things I wanted to say, but I second the idea of. I'm actually even a bit skeptical whether focusing on the regulation path is like the best option here, because, like Aleksi rightly said, a lot of these attacks, many of them don't even necessarily pose problems in IHL. So, for example, if I poison a system, so my enemy doesn't recognize my soldiers, that's a non-issue in IHL, but it's a huge issue for the owner of the system. So I think the best pathway to ensure these secure systems is just to play into the military needs of the users of these AI systems, because no matter what kinds of errors are induced by these adversarial attacks, whether civilians are being attacked or their own soldiers are being friendly fired, for example, it is still a huge issue for them. So I would say playing into the interests of the military actors here is, and raising awareness amongst them is the best course of action. And in terms of what they can do then, I would say that setting very clear requirements, very clear specifications as to the level of security we would want to see in the systems that you provide, dear vendors or dear industry partners, in terms of data security, model security, and just the security of the platform, I think that is a good approach, because industry is quite susceptible if many of their prospective customers just come with this requirement. They need to fulfill these requirements to be able to sell their products. So that would be what I would recommend.
Yeah. Okay. I think you just give it a second and then it'll work.
Thanks a lot for this interesting discussion. My name is Anke Allenhöfer. I work in the defense industry. My question is to Aleksi. You mentioned before the European regulations regarding the cybersecurity for the supply chain. I was wondering whether there are any other European regulations like the AI Act and any parts from these regulations that you think, or all of you think, are useful to adopt for military AI as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly, and like I said, the key is to look at those legal frameworks and see what would be useful for the military, what is something we need to consider. And to take a very easy example, I would say, the Cyber Resilience Act, right? So hardware security, the idea is very simple. All products sold in the European Union should have some base level of cybersecurity, right? You can't secure your AI systems because it will have to run on something if your hardware is not secure, right? So it would make sense to look at the Cyber Resilience Act as a military and see, well, are we getting the same effect through our own regulations and policies? And if we're not, then we should probably be inspired by this. Similarly with the AI Act, which of course is not applicable to national defense, there you have different ways of classifying AI systems into different categories of risk. Might make sense for the military to do the same type of thing, possibly with slightly different criteria to, well, basically to address what Jonathan said, that what is the risk profile of that system? Will it result in combat inefficiency? So you're not spotting enemy soldiers, for example. Can it result in violations of international humanitarian law? And taking in those considerations into account, and it's important to do that, of course, now, rather than when you actually need that cybersecurity to be in action in an armed conflict. So it is really a question of preparation, and I think it's an excellent way to look at the sort of civilian regulations that you have, look at the best practices, and think, can we apply this in our military context? Thank you for that question.
I mean, and one thing that I would add is that I think for a lot of these topics, we're thinking about, you know, how we can help the military domain, how we can maybe bring over things from the civilian domain to improve governance, to improve data security, to improve all these things. But we need to think about a two-way dialogue and to tighten civil-military affairs on a lot of these points, because a lot of the risks to military AI systems are risks that are present for municipal water authorities or for, you know, the local police departments, to a variety of emergency services, to a variety of necessary services that we are increasingly integrating with cloud-based, with autonomous, with AI-enabled capabilities. And we're seeing that there is an increasing appetite among adversary states to leverage that against us. So when we think about how use of AI might undermine our security, might undermine military effectiveness in a variety of ways, we also need to have an idea of how our use of AI in the civilian domain might undermine that as well. And keep in mind that our aim here is not just to increase military effectiveness. Our ultimate aim is to secure states and societies. And a part of securing states and societies is securing water supply, is securing energy infrastructure. And so we need to think about how we can partner the military and the civilian authorities in a lot of these domains, because the risks are the exact same risks. I think you're going to have to be our last question because we're running up on time. Yeah.
Am I audible? Yeah. This is Anamir Khan, Associate Director at CISS Islamabad. I focus on AI and the nexus of AI with nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So my question, first of all, stellar panel, and looking at responsible use through irresponsible use, that's unconventional, but worth talking about. Mm-hmm. So my question is that if an AI-driven ISR system, let's say hypothetically, achieves absolute transparency, mathematically providing the data about the tracking of the stealth submarines and mobile launchers in real time, does the operational decision to share such data, so-called such perfect data, with a commander constitute a strategic act of irresponsibility, considering that it could effectively terminate the possibility of second strike? And then are we seeing a future where nuclear deterrence becomes redundant? Because in the international nuclear order, major powers and nuclear weapon states rely on nuclear weapons for security purposes. How would that work out? Or is it just exaggeration? Thank you.
Thanks. Thoughts? No? No one has thoughts?
So I hear the monitor and I hear you, so I have a hard time to decipher the double. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's about nuclear risks and how we might incorporate AI into nuclear signaling, nuclear response, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think so. So just like cards on the table, that's not, I think, any of our area of expertise. I think that all of us, if I may speak for the panelists as well, are a little bit wary of using AI in nuclear deterrence, which I think is the case for most people in the room. It's not a great idea. And this was one of Jack Shanahan's points, which I think is very, very reasonable, is that and it's something that I think this panel brings forward as well, that we need to think about our use cases. What are our use cases and what are the risks of the use cases, our ethical, legal, military risks? And how can we mitigate these risks to the extent possible? And there's going to be some end of the spectrum where all the risks of using the system are pretty low and all the risks of not using the system are pretty high. So we have cyber defense, for example. And then we have the other end of the spectrum where all the risks of using the system are pretty high and all the risks of not using it are pretty low, or at least much lower. And I think nuclear is that end. And so I don't know if they would fully agree with this, but I think that there'd be general consensus that maybe don't would be the answer. Yeah, but it's an interesting point, and it's an interesting question. So,
time for one more, not?
I think, yeah, we could do one more question. But quick question.
Thank you very much. My name is Ganschow from the German Federal Ministry of Defense, and I have a rather practical question. But before I ask that, congratulations to this great panel. Nathan, I had high expectations after having had the honor to saw your panel back in Seoul 2 years ago. That was really great, so my expectations were not disappointed at all. It was really great to hear you. I think it's very significant, and it will inform my work as a policy officer in the German MOD. And therefore, my practical question would be, have you had a chance to take a look at the outcome document of the summit, the pathways to actions, and were you even maybe be able to contribute to that? Because if not, I mean, there are some relevant passages to this panel here. Then if you did, that would be great, because then I know that these things that we will exploit for our own regulations already are in here. And if not, where would you direct us to dive deeper and to get some references to what you said? Is that this book you mentioned? Because then it would be great to exploit that for our regulations and policies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, thank you for the question, because it relates perfect to the book. I think many of the summit conclusions in some shape or form also lead to the topics that we address in the book. It will be a book about armed conflict and the AI use in armed conflict, and also how it relates to cyber. We do that by looking at these topics through the same type of lens, like what is the current status, what are the trends, how is AI being used, for example, in detention, or how is it used in humanitarian aid. There may be something, there may not be a baseline yet. Then we look at what is the legal status at the moment, followed by recommendations. But because there are so many different topics, contemporary topics, I think that's already useful when writing policy, because you can at least see the legal underpinnings and then also the trends and policy considerations up to a point. But it's not just that. We also look at the way forward. We have some chapters in the end where we have one of the global commissioners as well, writing with her, REAM commissioners as well, writing her suggestions on where we should be heading. So it's also looking forward. So, end of commercial message, but I would recommend this book, and it comes out open access in about half a year through the CCDCOE website.
Yeah. Aleksi, you want to add something?
Yeah, just to end on a shameless bit of self-promotion of myself and the center, the cybersecurity of weapons systems article that I mentioned, which is also open access in the Journal of Cybersecurity, I would recommend that not only because it provides an overview of how international law applies to cybersecurity and what it requires, but also because we had a survey of our member nations and how they approached cybersecurity and weapons systems. And this translates to artificial intelligence as well, because the sort of old paradigm where you have digital systems, you have communication systems, and then you have kind of rifles, mechanical systems on one side. That's kind of going, right? You have artificial intelligence, you have digital systems that are being embodied in a wide range of different types of either weapon systems or other military systems. So how do actually countries set up their procurement and their testing, right? Because it's in some countries, it might be that if you have a digital system, or a communication system, it goes to one sort of procurement agency, and if it's sort of a traditional sort of kinetic system, it goes to another. I think it sheds very valuable light and has some suggestions on what should the militaries look in their own processes as well? Because we have the reality that weapon systems are being digitalized, military systems are being digitalized, and also artificial intelligence is starting to be integrated in them. So are your sort of procedures for the acquisition, for the testing, have they caught up to that reality? Or is it possible that you have some loopholes or gaps in there? So I would recommend also maybe having a quick read of that. Thank you.
Final note. Well, firstly, very happy to hear that this panel was of some use. But another point is that I completely understand your issue, because indeed finding sources that look into like this very specific triangle of you have like the military use of these adversarial attacks, but then which also looks at the computer science reality, and then plus the legal aspect is extremely rare. And we experienced this ourselves, because at some point we were afraid that Aleksi couldn't come, and we were stressing like, oh my God, like who should we invite? Because there's not a lot of people working on this. So I don't know if I'm speaking for everyone, but I'm sure that if you would like to reach out to us for questions on this topic, we would be very happy to help.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a nice spot to leave it. And because, as I said, this is a dialogue we need to keep having, and it's a coffee break now, so we can keep having this with a coffee. So with that, I'll leave everyone to coffee break. Thanks for coming and for your attention, and I hope this was of use to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you to our moderator, Dr. Nathan Wood. It was very interesting. Thank you so much. We have a very quick break now for a takeaway coffee. We will be back at 20 to 5, that is in roughly 10 minutes, with our Re-Aim Talks session number 1. And just a quick reminder, as I said again, those of you who have downloaded the app will have received an alert to activate certain networking features. Those of you who haven't, please do, because I cannot stress this enough. It is very, very useful, especially with multiple conferences or talks happening at the same time. So I'm not taking any more time of your coffee. And yeah, thank you, and thank you again to our panelists. Thank you.